1. Not so happy birthday, Xander. Treppis was dying, and there was nothing Xander could do to stop it. As the vampire slowly ran his hand along the tiger's heaving side, he forced a smile for his old friend's benefit. Behind him, visible within his mind's eye, he saw Estella standing in the doorway, looking in at the scene with a locked jaw and shimmering, tear-filled eyes. Her lip trembled slightly as her dark orange aura sagged, giving away her own wavering emotions. "You don't have to stay." Xander looked up at his lover for a long moment, once again forcing himself to smile for the sake of another's comfort. "He knows you care, and neither of us want to see you in pain." She attempted to return a smile, only to have a sob trickle out from her throat. Clapping her hand over her mouth, she turned and hurried out of the room, her steps resounding down the hall and dimming with her growing distance. Xander bit his lip and shook his head at the whole situation. His tiger friend hadn't been given much longer to live, a couple of days, maybe a week or two at the most, and though he wanted to have something to blame, the truth was that the animal was simply getting old. Sickness could be cured, but nothing, or at least nothing Xander could find, could stop nature's course. Even then, the tiger had lived well beyond what was expected of his species, though this fact didn't help to appease Xander or any of those who'd come to know Treppis. He'd thought, for a brief time, that perhaps he could find a pure-blooded Sangsuiga to bite Treppis and change him into a vampire. Hoped that he might save him by turning him to one of their kind. Unfortunately, along with the realization that the mutagens responsible for the transformation only worked on human DNA, there was the moral dilemma concerning whether or not Treppis would want to be turned. Dwelling on this, Xander wondered which he resented more, the biology or the ethics. Neither had been his strongest subjects as a human. Treppis took in another heavy, labored breath that was followed by a long exhale, and Xander shook his head. "I know it's boring, buddy." He gave Treppis a gentle scratch behind his left ear. The tiger let out a whimper and struggled to raise his head to face Xander. The earthy shades that made up the tiger's aura swirled about like smoke caught in a ceiling fan, and as Xander saw this, he suddenly had a craving for a cigarette. Scoffing at the notion of becoming an addict all over again, he passed it off as an emotional response and rose to his feet. "You get some rest," he said, keeping his voice low and noticing Treppis's ear twitch as he did. With that, he stepped out of the room and started in the direction that Estella had run off, navigating the halls as he let his mind wander. The mansion had, several years back, been the headquarters of the Odin clan, a clan that Xander's own father, Joseph Stryker, and a powerful Auric vampire named Dapok had teamed up to create. The duo's aspirations for peace and unity earned them many enemies, and those enemies had, over the course of nearly 2 decades, seen an end to not only Xander's father and Dapok, but the entire Odin clan itself. It had been then, following Xander's initiation, as he'd lain deep beneath the ground undergoing the change from human to vampire, that the radical naysayers had stormed the mansion and destroyed the once proud clan from the inside out. Even then, after all the changes that had come to pass, the memory of navigating those very halls before the chaos choked up the already emotional vampire. Fighting against the wave of depressing nostalgia, he sucked in a deep breath and swallowed away the lump in his throat as he turned a bend and started up the stairs that would take him to the ground level. Memories of the Odin clan were frequent for Xander. Though his time with them had been cut painfully brief, the mansion had been their headquarters, and they had been the closest thing he'd had to a real family. It was for this reason, as well as the determination to send a message that what had been lost had not been forgotten, that he'd reclaimed the old mansion and erected the newly formed Treppis clan in its place. Those with the Mythos government known as the Council, who'd worked directly with Xander's father, had been delighted when the still young vampire had approached them with the proposal to rebuild his father's legacy and further his own, and with their support, the renovations had taken no time at all. In the end, though he'd seen it coming all along, he'd had to accept the role of clan leader during a far too elaborate ceremony filled with far too many mythos who were all far too excited. He sighed and shook his head over the whole ordeal. Again. Exactly 2 years after he'd first been introduced to this building, and to the world of vampires and other mythos, now it was under new management. His management. He'd almost felt guilty for praying that the ceremony might be struck by a rogue attack. Almost. Like it or not, though, he was a clan leader now, blessed and burdened, all at once, with all the duties the title carried, and, as such, he held great power. But what did all of that matter if he could do nothing for his dying friend? "Happy birthday to me," he mumbled to himself. As he reached the top of the stairs, he started towards the larger set that led to the upper levels. But something stopped him in mid-step. Turning around, he pointed his gaze towards the hallway that led to the front entrance. He'd spent so much of that night in the underground level with Trappist that he hadn't realized that it had started raining. This, however, was a minor detail, a momentary and neutral discovery, and, ultimately, not what caught his attention or drew him towards the door. There was something else, something in the rain, something cold, something dark, something familiar. Xander didn't bother calling for somebody to investigate, though he knew that that was the proper protocol for such a situation, if there ever had been a situation before. The mansion perched atop a tall hill that overlooked the city, was neighbored by nothing but forests and wildlife, separated from the public streets by several miles of winding, unwelcoming pavement, canopied by dense trees. The unfriendly path was shadowy and foreboding, even on the brightest of days. Even those who were terribly lost seemed to know better than to follow blind hope to the mansion's gates, and, were an unwelcome wanderer ever to stumble upon the grounds, the large concrete wall that encompassed the mansion was certain to deter them. However, in the event that the too long, too dark, too perilous, and far too unfriendly wall weren't enough to stop an uninvited guest, in the event that somebody that devoid of common sense didn't get the hint, or, more likely, some of Xander's or the once proud Odin clan's enemies showed up, they had a very aggressive and lethal set of enchanted security precautions in place. This decision had been put into action soon after a few of the bolder rogues who had not approved of Xander's efforts had been caught trying to stop it on their own. Since then, any intruders that weren't cleared to enter were soon after ripped apart by some particularly nasty protection spells, the bug zapper enchantments that Estella had put in place. Simply put, if Xander Stryker didn't formally invite a visitor in, they weren't getting in. Period. End of story. No negotiations. But there, in the rain, was an exception. An unprecedented exception. An exception that demanded the proper response. As the leader of the clan, Xander more than understood the rules. He had made them, after all. In the event of any potential attack, whether or not the enchanted defenses had been successfully breached, the first person to detect it was to make the call for an armed response. After seeing what an attack had done to the Odin clan, Xander wasn't willing to take chances. There were to be no exceptions to that rule. An unwelcome intrusion was to be met with a fully armed team of Mythos warriors. But it was already the night of exceptions. And Xander knew that nobody, neither one nor 100 of the warriors with the Trappist clan, could fight what was coming. Nor, Xander smirked, would he order them to. Ignoring his own rule, he started towards the door. "Xander?" Estella's voice was still shaky as she called to him from the stairs that led to the second level. "Are you all right?" Pausing a few paces from the door, Xander let his aura linger a moment on the other side. The visitor was waiting just outside the door. He frowned. Waiting for what? I was just... Xander clucked his tongue and dragged his eyes away from the door and locked them onto Estella's. He wetted his lips, waiting to see if their guest would act before he'd have a chance to speak. When nothing threatened to interrupt him, he said, "We have a..." A shadow slipped past, an oily specter that moved with slick and rapid intent. Xander smirked. Not slick or rapid enough, however. The intruder was inside, already in the room with them, without the benefit of a door. Were it any other sort of visitor, Xander would have thought it was impossible, but impossible was exactly what their visitor specialized in. Any sort of barrier, walls, gates, enchantments, anything, didn't mean a thing when this one was involved. And, unsurprisingly, the intruder wanted to test them, to see what Xander and Estella were capable of. "Move!" Xander called out to his lover as he caught a sight of the shadow flying across the wall and over the railing towards Estella. Estella's eyes widened with awareness and, chanting something under her breath, she vaulted over the railing just as the intruder materialized behind her, a set of inky black limbs swinging in a desperate attempt to grab her. The magic that she'd called upon went off like a flare, bathing the staircase in a blinding light that radiated from the carpet. The visitor's shadowy form tremored, a high-pitched hiss rolling from its depths, and it drew back, a pair of bright blue eyes breaking through the solid black haze. "Couldn't be bothered to call first?" Xander scoffed as he leapt towards the figure. Calling upon his aura, Xander cast the red and black energy mass and ensnared the visitor. Seeing the blue eyes widen in surprise at his swiftness, Xander dropped down on his opponent. The intruder tried to jump back, but Xander's aura held. An inky fist flew for Xander's left temple. He rolled it under and drove his elbow forward, pushing his aura through the impact. The visitor made no sounds as it pitched back. Rather, it rolled like a wad of oil along a rain-slicked street, moving backwards up the stairs. Xander followed, shaking his head. The visitor wasn't retreating. He was leading them to the second level. "Do I pass, Professor?" he quipped, keeping pace after his opponent as he swiped out again and again with his aura at the living shadow and stumbling as it jumped over the attack. "Estella!" "On it!" a voice called from the first floor. Then, in a blink of an eye, she was on the second floor with the two of them, once again chanting a new spell. The magic ensnarled their opponent, Xander seeing her orange aura following her chants and binding the visitor. A few of the clan's members began to poke their curious gazes out, intrigued as to what their leader and his lover were struggling against. "You know," Xander sighed and shook his head at their intruder, "you could have just asked for an invite." Estella's chance faltered at that. "Xander, do you know this thing?" Chuckling, Xander nodded and wrapped his own aura around the intruder, beginning to strip away the layers of auric residue. "We both do, baby," he said, as the shadowy form melted away like wax dripping from a candle, until it revealed the smiling face of Xander and Estella's high school guidance counselor, Stan Furno. Long before his birth, Stan had been a simple human who, with a little help from Joseph Stryker and Dapoc, had unlocked the means to call upon great power from otherworldly forces. Despite wielding abilities that Xander's late vampire mentor had compared to a devil on Earth, Stan had pursued a life as a teacher and, years later, had honored his late friend's legacy by keeping a super-powered eye on his son. Before leaving to travel the world shortly after Xander's reawakening, however, Stan had worked with him to release his full auric potential and reunite him with the lingering spectral traces of the father he'd never had a chance to meet. "Hey," Stan smirked. "Am I too late to wish you a happy birthday?" Xander nodded. "Yeah, about 2 hours late, actually." Stan faked a pout. "Aw, missed the cake and..." Estella squealed excitedly as she jumped towards their visitor and wrapped her arms around him. "Oh my, Stan, it's been forever." Stan laughed at that and nodded, rubbing his left shoulder. "Forever, huh? Not sure about that. About 2 years by my count. But it's certainly been long enough. Just look at you. The timid bookworm, Estella Edash, finally out of her cocoon of shyness and taking to the streets as a truly beautiful vampire warrior." He shook his head in disbelief. "I couldn't be more proud." Estella beamed at the compliment as she stepped back to let Xander offer his greetings to their friend. Xander, still a bit taken aback by the sudden arrival of the man, if he could still go by such a simple title, who had kept him alive in a time when he wanted exactly the opposite, the man who had proven over and over to be so much more, and, as such, helped him become so much more. It was as if he'd never left. He looked no different than he had the day Xander had watched him vanish in the rearview mirror of a stolen sports car on the road to vengeance. He still had the same young, yet infinitely wise face, wearing the same bright, yet mysterious blue eyes, and adorned with a short, yet messy crown of blonde hair. He could have been any other human on any other day. But he was the exact opposite. Nothing ordinary, nothing simple. "I see the rumors haven't been exaggerated," Stan offered, smirking at Xander. "Though your mind still wanders quite a bit, I see." Ignoring the taunt, Xander cocked an eyebrow at his old friend. "The rumors?" Still smirking, Stan shifted his focus to Estella and nodded back toward Xander. "Is he always so modest, or is he still just as stubborn as ever?" he asked. Estella giggled. "Well, he's certainly not modest." "Thought so," Stan mused, chuckling to himself as he shook his head and looked back at Xander. "So much has changed, and yet so little, eh?" Xander looked past his friend to Estella. "Not modest? Really? Whose side are you on?" "Well, you're not." Estella flashed him a grin. He couldn't bring himself to argue. Instead, he looked back to Stan and, shrugging, tried again. "What are the rumors?" Stan rolled his eyes. "If you're not astute enough to pick up on them yourself, then I'm not going to spoil the hunt." He moved to scratch his temple and paused as his pointer and middle finger met, his still wet and travel-worn face. "Dear Lord, I must look like absolute hell. Pardon me a moment." He held up his left hand for silence and ran his right hand through his soaking wet hair. His fingers were met with no resistance as they passed through the gnarled and knotted strands, and when he'd finished, his blonde hair fell into place atop his dry and pristine head. Xander and Estella stared at him, startled that such a simple gesture would make it look as though he just stepped out of a salon. He smiled at their reactions as he made a similar pass over his face from his forehead to chin, the act offering a similar outcome for his once exhausted features and the start of stubble along his jaw. Then, clean-shaven, rejuvenated, and otherwise immaculate, he offered a slight bow. "There." He smiled and flexed his jaw, staring off into the distance for an uncomfortable moment, as though admiring his reflection in a non-existent mirror, before turning to Xander. "Isn't that better? Please tell me you didn't come here to perform cheap parlor tricks for my clan." Xander gave his old friend a punch in the shoulder. He didn't hold back. He knew he didn't need to. As the two shared a laugh, one of the clan's warriors appeared several feet away. "Is everything all right here?" the Sangstwiga asked, looking at Stan, sizing him up in the event that Xander actually gave the order to kill him, and running a hand along the grip of the sword at his side. A flick of his thumb brought an inch of the blade from the scabbard, while the rest of him stood patiently, ramrod straight and motionless, to await Xander's orders. Xander smirked and nodded. "Everything's fine," he assured the warrior. "Go tell the others not to worry." The vampire gave a single nod and let his sword fall back into place before disappearing once again into overdrive, leaving the three alone in the front hall. "Loyal," Stan smiled, nodding his approval. Xander rolled his eyes, not overlooking Stan's condescending tone. "They all are," he said in a low, flat voice. "And for the record, I wouldn't have needed an entire clan to take you out. I was about this close," he held out his fingers in a mock pinch, "to killing your ass while you were still standing out in the rain. If I hadn't taken the time to read your aura." He trailed off to let his reputation finish for him. "Then you'd have been even more embarrassed when I wiped the floor with you, and then followed it with yet another lesson in flexing your inquisitive nature over your brash instincts, wouldn't you?" Stan quipped, snapping his fingers for effect. As the sound resonated, the long black coat, which still looked unnaturally inky with rainwater, rippled like a distorted reflection when the shimmering haze finally calmed. Stan stood there before them in a finely tailored sports jacket over an AC/DC shirt and a pair of khakis. Lowering his right hand, Xander and Estella watched as a length of wood began to emerge from the floor, rising up to meet his hand. Estella clapped at the display as he gave the floor several taps with the wooden cane to finalize the act. Xander sighed at Estella. "Don't encourage the man." "Oh, hush," Estella nudged him. "That was incredible. How did you—" "Do it?" Stan shook his head. "A true master never gives away his secrets. But I will tell you it wasn't much different than my next trick." Xander groaned. "You're next." Stan's left hand shot out, stopping only a few inches from Xander's face. As Xander and Estella both blinked at the sudden movement and the looming threat of the gesture, the empty hand suddenly opened up and plop. The two jumped back as a small travel bag fell out of nowhere and into Stan's outstretched hand. Thank you. I'll be here all week." Stan smirked and gave a bow. "Be sure to try the veal, and don't forget to tip your waitress." Xander frowned and took a step towards Stan, opening up a private psychic connection. He didn't need Estella worrying. Not yet, at least. "What is this really about?" Xander demanded. "You disappear for all this time, and then show up to spar and do some cheesy magic show? You could have taken this entire building apart and walked into the grounds and reassembled it around you. Could have put everyone in this building, myself and Estella included, to sleep while you did it too. But you chose to make the most public entrance possible." Stan frowned and looked over at him. "I'd heard you were doing well and wanted to check in." "Then where were you when I needed you, huh? Where were you when I was being hunted down by Dapok's vengeful son? You know, the guy that butchered the Odin clan? Your friends? And my father? Where were you when Marcus was getting his head lopped off? Or how about when Estella was kidnapped and her parents were ripped apart in front of her? Was it not worth checking in then? Don't you think a flashy entrance and a few well-placed magic tricks would have been nice for any of those moments? You know that I died, right? You catch that little detail in the rumors? Yeah, I died. Dead. Like fucking gone, Stan. And Estella nearly killed herself as well, working to bring me back. How easy would that have been for you?" Xander narrowed his eyes at him. "You're not a bad man, Stan, so I know you weren't missing all of that for nothing. You were doing something out there for all this time. I know, and I understand. But you're here now, over any of those other times, and it certainly ain't for our sake. And I want to know why." Estella cleared her throat and crossed her arms. "Do you two think I'm so clueless as to actually believe that you're just staring at one another? You do realize that both of your faces are still emoting with whatever it is you're thought-talking, right?" Xander frowned and looked down. "Damn." Stan laughed. "Don't be too surprised. She always was a smart one, Xander." He turned towards Estella, offering a nod. Xander was just expressing some understandable skepticism towards the situation. He glanced back at Xander and nodded again. "And I'm sorry to say they're not misplaced skepticisms." clearing his throat, he turned and started up the stairs. "I'd rather not discuss it in clear view of your clanmates, however," he explained. "So I'll be waiting in your office." Xander let his eyes fall closed and sighed, nodding. "Third floor. It was Dapok's old office, I know," Stan called back with a chuckle. "And speaking of which, we still need to work on that psychic shield of yours." There was no talking Estella out of joining them to hear Stan's news. To make matters worse, she was already nervous. Despite all his strength and powers, Xander's sudden entrance into his office still made Stan flinch. "You ready to tell me what this is really all about?" Xander glared, slamming the door behind him, and Estella noticing his old friend flinch for a second time. Stan frowned and looked over. "I want to start by apologizing for not being here to help when things got bad. It broke my heart when I got word of what Lennox was putting you all through, but..." Estella visibly shuddered at the mention of the murderous vampire who had turned her, and Xander reached over to give her hand a gentle squeeze. Though Estella had finally found her niche as a vampire, the memory of the rogue that had turned her was still one that gave her nightmares. Not that Xander could blame her, though. Lennox had been nothing short of a lunatic, and Xander had encountered his fair share of crazies to gauge from, who had left a horrific stain of memories within his mind as well. The bitter and vengeful son of Dapok had been enraged with his father for dedicating his efforts with the Odin clan in the States when, unbeknownst to him, his wife had died in Finland. Choosing to overlook his own direct involvement in his mother's death, Lennox had placed all blame on his father and the American warrior who'd driven him to stray in the first place, Joseph Stryker. Eager to see every shred of legacy that had been built destroyed, Lennox had proudly boasted the murder of both the late Odin clan's creators as well as the ringleader behind the entire massacre. He'd been so intent on ruining Xander's already sketchy image that, after going through great lengths to stir up trouble and literally throw Xander's name all over it, he'd gone after Estella. Though Xander had succeeded in killing him, it was not before he'd taken the life of his mentor and transformed the girl he loved. All things considered, even Xander had to admit that he still got a shiver at the memory. Seeing their reactions, Stan bit his lip and offered her an apologetic nod. Estella smiled weakly. "I can't say that I'm happy with what happened, but it has allowed me and Xander to have this life together, and I wouldn't trade that for the world." Xander growled and shook his head. "Though it would have been nice if you'd told me about that psychopath in the first place." Stan shook his head. "I am sorry about what happened, Xander, but the less you knew at the time, the better." "How do you figure that?" Xander glared. "People died because of that son of a bitch." Stan looked down at that and sighed. "Xander," Estella looked over. "Please, I know it hurts, but you can't blame him." "No, Estella," Stan nodded. "I might not have been able to tell Xander everything before I had left, but that didn't mean you all deserved to be left without any warning. I was preoccupied with my own concerns, and I was careless, and for that, I am sorry." He looked over at Xander, shaking his head. "Believe me, I wish I could change how I'd done things, but I can't regret what I did. No fault I accept can change the truth." "What truth?" Xander demanded. "That you would have leapt at the chance to avenge your father," Stan offered, narrowing his eyes at Xander. "It's the same reason I don't tell you any number of things right now. You're not ready to hear them. You're still impatient and arrogant and, despite everything, morbidly self-destructive. With the wrong truths in your mind, you'd act too quickly, and you would die. Be truthful with yourself, Xander. You were barely ready to take on Lennox." Xander scowled and shook his head, not wanting to acknowledge what his old friend said as the truth. Stan nodded, seeing that Xander understood. "You progressed as you were meant to. Any other path would have been catastrophic. With any luck, You might actually see what's coming through with your head still on your shoulders. Xander frowned. What? You can see the future now or something? Oh no, nothing like that, Stan assured him. He sighed. I know that there are still struggles for you to face when the time is right. All hocus-pocus bullshit put to rest, Stan. Xander bit his lip, unable to keep a tear from falling across his cheek. You could have been here. Xander struggled to hold himself together, not wanting to have yet another emotional collapse in front of Estella. Furthermore, while Stan, even before Xander had been turned, had seen the young man at some terrible lows and, on many occasions, even helped to drag him out of them, there was a reluctance to let the pain he was feeling show to his old guidance counselor. He knew that, like always, Stan's words held not only great wisdom, but great truth as well. He'd always been one to leap before he looked, often opting out of looking for the sole purpose of having an excuse to come out of it wearing the wounds he felt he deserved. And if he'd known that the likes of Lennox and who else were out there, just waiting to cause him trouble at some point or another, he'd go out of his way, strong enough or not, to get them first. Even with that truth burning too bright to ignore, however, he still couldn't bring himself to forgive Stan for being gone all that time. A whimper slipped from Xander's throat. There was so much he wanted to say, so many sentiments he wanted to express, and, despite all his growing and everything he'd learned, he couldn't bring himself to know how to say them. Stan had, more times than Xander wanted to admit, even to himself, saved his life and continued to instill him with a fighter spirit. Even when nobody, not even himself, had faith in him, Stan had been there to remind Xander that there was reason to get up each morning. It had even been Stan that had gotten him reunited with Estella. Stan had been at every pivotal moment, pushing and motivating and cheering and encouraging. The truth was, he'd been the closest thing Xander had ever had to a father. And now, facing him after all that time, Xander had to come to grips with the fact that he'd felt abandoned, and that it was that pain that he resented Stan for the most. I miss you too, Xander, Stan nodded. And I am sorry that I had to leave you like that. You deserve more of an explanation. Xander bit his lip as more tears spilled from his eyes. Though he didn't take his eyes from Stan, he felt Estella's arms wrap around his left arm, and the thread of a smile tugged at his lip as she whispered that it was all right. It didn't feel all right. The explanation. He fought against the lump in his throat and his voice's threats to crack like a sheet of ice and drop him into the frigid depths of silence. Can I hear it now? Stan sighed and nodded. It's only fair, I suppose. His aura writhed in slow, tight spirals of torment and regret as he leaned forward like he always had when he had a story to tell. What I am, what I can do, and the abilities I possess is not something that is exclusively mine. They are, when all is said and done, a gift that I was able to request access to from powerful forces beyond this realm. That's all, he chortled at his own thoughts. I'm just a very powerful asker, an exceptional prayer, I suppose you'd say. What makes me special over all others, though, is that my prayers were delivered in person to, well, whatever you'd like to call the other side, while others have their voices lost in the near infinity existing between us and there. But I'm not the only one who can reach that far. There were those before me who could do it, and there are those who will come after me who can do it. Xander frowned. So, what does that have to do with why you left? Stan rubbed the back of his neck. Because sometimes the ones that can do it aren't good people, Xander, and when somebody awful gets that kind of power, the first thing they do is target anybody else with that power, the only one strong enough to stop them, and make sure that they aren't around to interfere with what they plan to do next. There was another one like you? Xander shook his head. So why leave? Why not just wait for them to show up and then take them apart? You've seen what I can do, Xander. Stan rolled his eyes. Now imagine what I could do if I didn't care about anything but destroying somebody else like me. Didn't care who I hurt or how much damage I caused. Now, I've gotten quite advanced in my travels, I'll admit, and what I can do doesn't necessarily represent what anybody who's been gifted with that power can do, but even a novice can turn this city into ash within only a few days. As soon as I knew that there was another one like me, one who was hell-bent on finding me and destroying me, I knew I had to lead them away from here. For a while, it was touch and go. Sometimes I'd lose them and have to double around to make sure that they didn't just start running amok wherever they'd landed themselves. And other times, I had to take extreme measures to go into hiding just to keep them moving, keep them using their powers to find me, so that I could get a lock on them, just so I could start all over again. A few times, we'd wind up coming toe-to-toe, and it was always a total mess that I'd typically have to duck out of just to avoid having untold destruction on my conscience. About half a year ago, however, I was getting hopeful that I'd be able to lead them somewhere vast and desolate, where I could finally dispatch them easily without the threat of lost lives or property. And I made my way for Australia. Estella looked over. Why Australia? Vast deserts and very little media coverage. Trust me, the first isn't hard to find, but the latter, Stan shrugged. Seemed like a decent enough option to lure this guy in and deal with him quick and clean. Xander clunked his tongue. He knew a giant but set up when he heard it coming. So what went wrong? He asked, cutting to the chase. Stan looked over at him. He showed up with others. Others? Estella frowned. You mean others like you? Like us, Stan corrected her. Remember, I am not unique, not by a long shot now, but, he nodded. Yes, they're all just as empowered as he is. Xander shook his head. What do you mean? How many more? I get that you're not the only one who can do this, but goddamn, just how many can if this guy has help? Stan sighed. That's the thing, Xander. The others didn't earn the power, though that's really giving the other guy a great deal more credit than he deserves. Well, if they didn't earn their powers, Estella chewed her lip for a moment, then how did they? The other one gave them the power, Stan finished, shaking his head. See, this other guy might be shifty as a bag of snakes, but he's not stupid. He's made an entire life out of being a destructive, power-hungry sociopath. So when I lured him into a massive plane of nothing, he caught wind of what I was plotting and decided to show up with reinforcements. 3 others, to be precise. And the 4 of them came at me with all they had. Xander sneered. Cowards! What'd you do? Estella pressed. Stan shrugged. What I'd gone there to do. I fought. For nearly 13 goddamn straight weeks. God, Xander shook his head. How is that even possible? Stan smirked. You'd be surprised what those like us are capable of, Xander. I only can pray you never have to experience it for yourself. Xander nodded and smirked. So you kicked their asses, right? I mean, you're here now, so you must have finally put all of them down in that desert for the ultimate dirt nap, right? Stan's face lost color and his eyes sank to the floor. Estella's eyes widened. Xander's eyes narrowed. You did kill them, didn't you, Stan? You have to understand, Xander. Stan held up a hand. I'd never been up against one other person like me before, let alone 4. Xander took a step toward him. Stan? I put them in the center of the earth, Xander. I mean, we fought and fought and fought, and I was certain I had the upper hand. I figured trapping them in the earth's core would do the trick. At the very least, they'd be stuck there for the rest of time. Xander's fangs started to unsheathe. Then there, Stan nodded slowly. I felt their life forces swell back into existence just before I landed, so I was certain that it was finally over. I thought it was safe to come home. Estella shivered. Then they're coming here? Stan closed his eyes. I can't be sure. I was afraid that they might have already beaten me here, but if they haven't, there might still be a chance that they won't. Xander frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Did you not hear me? I left them in the center of the earth, Xander. Stan gave him an exasperated look. That's not exactly the kind of prison that anybody just breaks out of. I'd hoped they were dead, but it would appear that they've got a strong enough hold on their powers to keep their physical bodies intact under some rather strenuous conditions. That's supposed to make me feel better, smartass, Xander sneered. Stan shrugged. I suppose not. The fact that they didn't show up here an hour before me and incinerate the place should, though. Estella gasped. Xander glared. Stan sighed. Look, this guy knows where I am, but that's it right now. He doesn't know why, and he doesn't know who I'm here to see. That sort of information he'd have to be near enough for me to siphon. And, once again, they're in the center of the friggin' planet. So, no, I didn't just show up to reminisce and crash your groovy pad. You caught me there. It had started that way, sure, but shit went down. I'm sure you know all about that. He motioned up at the two of them. Both of you. He rolled his eyes and leaned back. The moment I thought there was a chance he could be here, I made a point of coming in with every possible defense in my favor. But they're not here, not anywhere in this entire city. So it's still a very fair chance that they're still, say it with me kids, in the center of the friggin' planet. And there is a very strong possibility that they'll never get out of there. Ever.